This is a very special talk. I want to welcome all the family members who are here. I know some of them, so welcome. So this evening, our speaker is Mr. Cary Skidmore. After completing engineering degrees at Kansas State University with a BS in chemical engineering and an MS in mechanical engineering, Cary came to work at Los Alamos National Laboratory in January 1985. He supervised his first series of experiments involving the detonation of high explosives in November 1991. Since that time, he has been actively involved in explosives operations from a variety of perspectives for a number of organizations at different sites. One consistent area of interest has been the insensitive high explosives, PPX 9502, used in some nuclear weapon systems for safety reasons. At the personal level, Cary and his wife of 31 years, more than 31 years.
Who's here? Wendy. Stand up.
Hi, Wendy. Cary and Wendy are the parents of 5 children. 4 of them graduated from Los Alamos High School, the other LAHS, as Cary says. They are married. The children are married and beginning families of their own. The youngest child, that's the 5th, is a sophomore at Los Alamos High School and working there as an athletic trainer. That's why they haven't graduated yet. They're still working on it. Okay. Cary's principal involvement with the community has been in the congregations of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the units of the Boy Scouts of America. So everyone, let's give a round of applause for Cary Skidmore.
It's humbling to be here with you tonight. I'm honored to be the one that gets to tell this story. It's clear by the size of the audience and the composition of the audience that it's a story that needs to be told, a story that's long overdue. I know that it was a hardship for some people to come, and so I'm glad for each person that's here. I know that we have here children of some of the victims of the fatalities, at least one widow. We have a group leader that was here at the time in 1959, a high explosives machinist that was here in 1959. And we have grandchildren that are here. We have people who have served as explosive safety officers in the past and are serving in that position today for the laboratory, people that are explosives workers, a large variety of people that are here who feel this story. It's not just a dissemination of information. This is a story that we live and that we feel. And I also feel it, and I hope you'll get that, some reasons for that as we go through the talk tonight. I began with the video of the explosions. All of those explosions were experiments that were done here at Los Alamos National Laboratory, except for one, and Los Alamos scientists were involved in that one, but that was done in a different place. This video was created for a new exhibit at the Bradbury Science Museum on high explosives work here at Los Alamos. It's under development. We expect it to be through for an opening in August, but you could go see it in its draft form, so to speak, in its developmental form over in the weapons display area at the Bradbury Science Museum. This video is also available on YouTube, so if you liked it, you can watch it again. Part of the reason to show it, and it's kind of set to music, it's kind of nice. I had one son said, "You set explosions to music? That seems kind of strange." But when you watch it, for me, the science of high explosives is exciting. And so my first thesis statement, and it's an important point to understand before we get to the fatalities, is that high explosive science was born at Los Alamos on the 4th of July, 70 years ago, 1943. So we begin the story there. Before World War II, explosives were used to blow things up, to break things apart, to destroy, sometimes throw or to propel. There wasn't much science. It was experiment. It was trial and error. What works, what doesn't work. So it was kind of a crude technology, but it was okay. It did lots of good things. They could still build roads and mine and those kinds of things and do military operations. But there was, when the Manhattan Project came to Los Alamos, there was a new need that developed, and so there was a need for this high explosive science. The knowledge didn't presently exist anywhere. The most work was being done at the Explosives Research Laboratory in Brewston, Pennsylvania. George Kistiakowski was the leader there, and he brought a set of men, and they came to Los Alamos to help work with the high explosives problems during the Manhattan Project. So the idea of an implosion, that is to take something that is, we'll say, hollow, and shrink it down and make it small. So if you have some fissile material and it's subcritical, if you want a nuclear explosion, you got to smash it all together quickly to get it to create the nuclear explosion. So think of that as implosion. So this idea was around, and the first test of it was an explosives experiment on July 4th. Seth Nettermeyer, it was his idea, so he got together some explosives. They took a 2-foot length of a sewer pipe, put the TNT explosives in this case around the outside of it, had 4 detonators around it, and they lit those 4 detonators more or less simultaneously, and they smashed what was originally this hollow cylinder into a compressed cylinder. So they proved that the idea can work. There was a lot more to try to understand why it works, what the parameters are, how thick it is, how much explosive to use, all those kinds of things. And the cylinder wasn't really the way it needed to be used. It needed to be done with a sphere. That's even more complicated. The first test of a spherical implosion system was on July 16th, 1945. It took 2 years to get from the first cylinder experiment to the first, and that one was without nuclear material, that was just on a sewer pipe, to a real spherical implosion with fissile material inside. This was the Trinity device, the gadget that was detonated at Trinity site in southern New Mexico. But to get to this point, you had to have precisely shaped pieces of explosive without hollow spots on the inside. We call those voids. And you had to focus this energy down to the middle. Just like you can take a magnifying glass and focus sunlight onto a single spot and put a lot of energy on a single spot, you can do that with explosives also, if you understand the properties of explosives. And so that was the project, that was the design. So I say that this is how high explosive science was invented. So it's a new technology, it's a new science, and there has to be some safety things that come along with it. I want to emphasize that safety was important from the beginning days of the laboratory. The first director, Oppenheimer, in 1945, in his guidance and directives, said each employee can do more to protect himself and his fellow workers than all the rules in the world. It is of utmost importance that each of us feel at all times the responsibility of safeguarding himself and others. This was the philosophy for the whole laboratory. After the accidents that I'm going to tell you about, the then laboratory director, Norris Bradbury, in the early 60s, they came up with a LASL explosive safety handbook. This is a copy of it here. And in the foreword to this, in the preface, he says, "We expect you to work without taking chances with human safety, either yours or anyone else's." So I've been working in the explosives areas of the laboratory for decades now, and this safety theme is one that's taken seriously. So if you are cavalier or casual in your handling of explosives, your colleagues get really nervous, and they don't really tolerate that. So this isn't just a paperwork, checkbook, sort of a safety thing. This is real safety. And so this is still the philosophy at the laboratory today. I wanted to emphasize that. So we also have the technology of high explosives, the science of high explosives. I think about that as how things work, why things work. And the technology of high explosives is how do we work with these materials. So in the beginning, we were working with TNT-based materials. The next slide that I show will talk a little bit more about that and the transition that came. But TNT is a common explosive. It was probably the most used explosive in World War II. People were familiar with it. Military people already had lots of experience with it. People are pretty comfortable with it. It's a relatively safe explosive. And so we have this little anecdote from the early years of explosives work at S site where somebody had a chunk of explosive and using a carpenter's saw, kneeling on it, cutting off a piece, using a garden hose for coolant to cool it down with water. And that was kind of the early approach to it, and it was okay. One of the accidents involves drilling. So I also want to take a moment and point out that when they were building the Trinity device, they needed to have enough high explosive charges for that experiment and also enough to build the real nuclear weapon that went to Japan, because it had to be on its way even before they had successful completion of the experiment. So they needed lots of these charges. They were difficult to make. And so George Kistiakowsky, who was a leader and a manager in explosives work and a scientist, he got a dentist drill and drilled out the tiny void spots or the empty spaces in the explosive which can wreck things. And so the experiment doesn't work, the nuclear weapon doesn't work. And so he did that all one night. That's what the references say. And then he would refill them with new explosive or some other material that would, so the whole thing would work. So drilling explosives, manual cutting of explosives, all that was at the early beginnings of working with explosives at the laboratory. Then we come into a time of transition. TNT doesn't have that much energy. We wanted higher energy explosives for a variety of reasons. Also, TNT can crack. We didn't want that. So there was a technology evolved so that we could make stronger, less likely to break explosives, and they're more powerful. So it's a transition in technologies from this TNT or trinitrotoluene, that's a chemical name, to a PBX or plastic bonded explosive. That's not a chemical name, that's just an acronym. And so some of the changes are, so TNT, to get it more energetic, you would mix some high energy powder into it. We use RDX, HMX, and then you'd pour it into a mold. It melts at a temperature lower than the boiling point of water, so you could use a double boiler like in your kitchen or for making candy or something. You could melt this TNT, you could pour it into a mold. You'd let it cool, then you would cut it to final shape with machine tools. And then we moved to this plastic bond explosive. So in this one, you could get some high energy powder mixed in with the TNT, but with this technology, you could get a lot of high energy powder. This is like 95% high energy powder, and this is like 75% high energy powder. So it's a different technology to create it, and if you want it to get to be a solid shape, you have to do things a little bit different. And so this might be a little bit hard to visualize, but this is hollow on the inside. So you take these little BBs of this PBX, this plastic bonded explosive, and you drop it down in there, and then you close this, and you apply heat and pressure, and you come out with a solid piece that's really strong. And then you can take that and cut that to final shape for your application. So we're starting now to use, TNT is a pretty safe material. These higher energy powders, because they're higher energy, could do more damage, and the way that we needed to handle them, we needed to discover how to handle them a little bit differently. So the first accident was not involving a TNT or a PBX, but I give you that background. For the next two accidents, it's really important, and just in the evolution of the technology, I mentioned those things. So the first accident was in 1956, Candelario Escobar. He was the youngest of the fatalities. He was 29 years old. This was a new detonator material, so it was a powdered explosive. They had done a little bit with it in previous years and made a bunch of it and put it on the shelf and stored it away. Then they came up with a new idea. Hey, we think this would work for a safer detonator. So they got it back out. It's stored wet because it's kind of sensitive, and that's traditional to store explosives powders wet to make them safer in storage. So Candelario, Mr. Escobar's task was to dry this powder. It had been dried before. He wasn't the first one to do it. So he had these 7 metal trays, porcelain-lined metal trays that were in the oven here. This is a drying oven, side view of it. And so he would heat it up to drive off the water. And then his job was to scoop out this powdered explosive and put it into some glass jars with rubber stoppers so that it was ready for people to use in their experiments. So he was about halfway through with that job when the detonation went off. This is a simulated view of the bay, and I'll show you what it looked like afterwards. So I will mention we have a very large audience here tonight, and so if you can't see the pictures, I do have over there on a table some photo albums, one for each of the 3 accidents. I went to photo archives and got all the photos that were taken of the post-accidents, and they're there if you want to browse them after we get through here. Many of the photos are forensic in nature, how they determined where the explosion occurred and some of those kinds of things. So those may not be of interest, but there may be some that are of interest if you want to browse through them. You had a question?
I was just going to ask, you field any questions as we go?
So I'm happy to do that. There is a tradition, I think, that this is kind of a lecture format. Is it okay to deviate from that tonight? I can't see Todd around. Okay. So let's do that. I want to I have 26 slides, just so you know. We're on slide number 9. I don't want to make it a long evening, but I do want to make it a little bit interactive. So do you have a...
I'd also like to mention that we do tape all of our lectures through Pack-8, and that they are available in about a week or 2. I'm not sure exactly in which format. Are they available for our podcast?
No, they'll be aired on Pack-8. They'll be available on DVD from Pack-8.
So you can get copies, you can view them in a much better format again. So don't despair if you can't see the screen at this time or you miss a detail.
And so if there is a question, we'll want you to speak into the microphone so it picks up on the recording and so everybody can hear the question as well. And we'll have a time at the end for questions and answers as well. So is that a general question, or do you have one right now? Okay, so I'm going to set the microphone right here so we're ready to go when that time comes. Okay, so this accident, this is the oven afterwards. These are the trays inside the oven. I know there was 2 explosions involved in this one. One of them was over on the table that you saw in the previous picture. They know from the injuries to the man and from all the scores in this ceramic tile on these 2 walls and its height that he was working at the table when the explosion happened. And they also know there was a secondary explosion because of the way the shells were damaged. In some of the pictures, it's a little bit easier to see. They got them all stacked up next to each other. And you glance at that and you can say, oh yeah, that's obvious that there was an explosion on that shelf. So that's just a few other details. These smudges are from the rubber stoppers in the glass jars. You don't, I'm going to explain blowout walls are explosives facilities. One of the walls is frangible. It's easy for it to come out. It's called a blowout wall. The idea is that if there is an accidental explosion, you release the pressure out through that door, that wall, and to help protect the explosion from going anywhere else or being uncontrolled. It's kind of a way of directing the explosion out into unoccupied space. So this one, the wall is gone, the doors are all gone. This is the blowout wall. You'll see that again in the next indoor accident also. So those are the things to mention about that one. This is the overall scene after the accident. This is the bay where it happened. This is the oven. So you can see that these still have their blowout partitions and the doors there. This is a building that's still in use today with the same application. We have people here who have worked in this building and drying explosives, ovens, that's the sort of thing that goes on in that building. So we learned a lot of things from this accident. We've changed some ways that we do our explosives operations. This is an aluminum scoop that was recovered after the accident. That's what an aluminum scoop looks like beforehand. He was using this scoop when the explosion happened, and so before this time we were doing impact sensitivity testing of explosives. After this accident we became concerned about a friction insult and a spark, electrostatic spark insult, And so tests were developed to evaluate explosives for those kinds of insults. Will they react under those kinds of conditions? An explosive sensitivity committee was formed to say, hey, before we work with these things, we need to understand them a little bit better. Again, they had been working with this material for a few years, and this wasn't the first drying operation, but it was still a surprise. So sensitivity is a difficult thing to define, a difficult thing to measure, and to interpret. So let's see, we use plastic scoops now instead of these aluminum scoops. And today we still have surprises in working with explosives, but they're small surprises, not big surprises, because we're limited now. We limit ourselves. If it's a new material, we're working with it with very small amounts, like 2 grams. You get familiar with it, you work with it, maybe you go up to 10 grams then, and there's kind of this graduation to where you're starting to work with massive amounts of explosives, and you're evaluating the explosive all along the way. After this one, we were evaluating sensitivity on powders at small scales, like milligrams, half a gram, that sort of thing. And that's an important point for when we get to the last accident. So this is the second accident. This is the setup for this one. So there's 2 people involved in this one, Leo Garin and Ray Means. This happened 54 years ago this month. S-Site back in those days was working 2 shifts. Earlier in the 1950s, they were working 3 shifts. There was a lot of explosives work going on. This was a machining accident. It was happening in a machining bay of a building that's over 700 feet long. At the time, as I understand it, had 24 operating machining bays in it, and those were all machine operations, and they were working 2 shifts. And this accident happened on the swing shift. This white block here, this is, again, is a simulated setup. This white block was an explosive called PBX 9404, and it was 7.5 pounds. There was 50 pounds in the previous accident. This one's 7.5 pounds. And the task of the day was to drill a tiny hole in it, 1/16 inch diameter and 2 inches deep. And there weren't adequate drills available, so they customized their own drill. This shank was made out of a hypodermic needle, and they soldered onto the end of it a cutting tip. So, but again, this wasn't the first time they'd done this operation. If a close read of the accident report suggests that it was done 400 times before with the same size of a hole, same sort of a drill bit setup. So it was expected to be a safe and routine operation. However, the operator of this drill press is standing in front of it. Another reason why it was considered to be safe, another indication that it was considered to be safe. So just like you would stand at a drill press for some wood in your garage or something, you know, handles up here, you bring it down, and the bit comes down, and you drill your hole. So the technique that was considered to be safe is water flowed in through the hollow drill shank to provide cooling. We still use water as a coolant today in our explosives machining to keep the explosive from getting hot. So when we consider causes of the accident, could the drill have broken because it's hypodermic needles are brittle? Could it have gotten plugged? It would have been easy for it to get plugged, and water isn't flowing through it and it gets hot. Don't know exactly. It is clear that this is that he was doing the drilling when the accident happened. Leo Garin was the one who was operating the drill press. It's my understanding that Ray Means was in the bay working on another project, and that his presence was required at some level because it was attended drilling of a small hole, and so there needed to be a second person in the area. This is what the bay looked like after the accident. The drill press was over here in this part of the room, and this was all covered by the blowout wall. I'll show that in the next picture. There are pieces of explosive that are on this table. Those were not involved in the accident or in the detonation. They didn't go. But even today, as a precaution, we only have the explosives out that we're working on. The others are safely stored nearby until you're ready to work on them, so you don't keep a lot of pieces around. So this was an accident with a PBX 9404. Like I told you, we had this shift in technology from TNT-based materials to this PBX type material. This is the overall scene after the accident. This is the bay where it happened. This is bay 2. Bay 1's down there. You got 24 more that go down that way. There's 25 today. The blowout wall all came out, as I mentioned. This is where they would walk into the bay. When I get to the point of describing a memorial, I'm going to say that it's on the wall, and the wall that it's on would be on the outside wall of this bay, out in this area there. It's on site, as close as we could make it. So we go to the third accident. I'm going to combine the lessons learned from the second and third accident into the same one because they were only separated by months. The same explosive was involved. There are some actions that were taken after the first accident, but I'm summarizing them all together as the two accidents together. So 4 people were killed in this accident. Mr. Pacheco, Mr. Cordova, Mr. Lujan, Mr. Martinez. And this one involved 300 pounds of explosive. And I explain how we had 300 pounds of explosive involved in the next slide. But first of all, there was a very large piece of PBX 9404. You remember that was the explosive in the drilling accident as well. There also was another PBX 9010, and so in doing this machine, if you think of cutting on a wood lathe or something, you generate wood chips or sawdust if you're sawing. So same with machining explosives, you generate that kind of waste and residue. So it's collected and gathered up and needs to be treated, and it was treated by burning. That was a clean, safe way to treat explosives, and we still do that today. So the suspected cause, and I'll go through the setup and the layout a little bit more in some of the next pictures, was either there was a drop of the large PBX 9404 piece because it was difficult for one person to handle. 2 people were handling it, we believe, and still heavy and awkward for them. And I'll get into some other details. Or the PBX 9010 chips, maybe they were part of it, or maybe it was a combination of the two. This is the layout of the scene before the accident. So this is the truck that was bringing the explosives in. 2 of the men were driving this truck, and they backed it in, and it was ready to unload. Even before they brought these cans, and I'll show you, was that in the last picture? Yeah. So these cans, can you see the HE on there? And so these are just metal, galvanized metal trash cans, and you throw your scrap pieces of explosive in there, and that's how they were picked up and hauled to the burn grounds. Or you had boxes like this with little scraps. These are like the TNT-based stuff. This is a little bit harder for me to tell what kind of explosive is in those cans. The accident report might say in detail. So there was 8 of these cans, as I recall, on the truck. This is where they were positioned. They know exactly where they were positioned because of the damage to the bed of the truck. It leaves an imprint of these circles. If you look at one of the pictures over there that I'm not going to show here, you can see that very clearly. It's a wooden bed, and they put it back together, every piece of it, lots and lots and lots of pieces, and they knew exactly where these cans were, and they know that the explosion happened below the level of the bed of the truck because of the way the bed came up and left the imprint of these cans. That's all explosives accident forensic stuff. So, but I do want to explain and emphasize the complexity of the operation they were doing today, because one of the things we do today is we don't try to do all this at once anymore. So this big area right here is PBX 9010 machining waste. So all this scrap that I was telling you about, these machining chips, this sawdust-like stuff, it's wet because we use water as a coolant, and we want to keep it wet anyway because it's safer to handle that way. But harder to get it to burn if it's wet, so they spread it out the day before, And so, to a certain level of thickness and to let it dry. These figures here are the presumed locations of the 4 people at the time. So one of them over there, we presume that he was checking this to see if it was dry enough to burn, if it was ready to use. We also have big pieces of equipment over here, ovens and oil pumps and vacuum pumps and electric motors and things that were contaminated with explosives. They had explosives in them. They weren't useful as pieces of equipment anymore. So using the heat from the burn of the explosives, by the way, I should make it clear that burning explosives in general is a benign but very hot activity. We don't anticipate a detonation. We're prepared for it in general, but when they're not confined, I don't want to get too technical, but a large piece of explosive can burn safely. So this kind of operation had been going on for a long time without any detonations or explosions. So you had boxes of explosives like I showed in the previous picture. Some of those were on the truck. Those had probably already been unloaded. You had these still waiting to be unloaded. So you had one person in the bed of the truck helping unload things from there. These are the 2 people that are carrying the heavy, large hemisphere of PBX 9404. The tailgate on this truck, a hydraulic lift, was neither all the way up nor all the way down, halfway up. Did the explosion cause it to be that way? The real presumed situation is that maybe it was being used as a step to get from the bed of the truck with this heavy thing and down onto the ground. The surface here is gravel. The way I understand it, this PBX 9010 was on gravel, on the ground for sure. So that's kind of the layout. So you see the orientation of the truck the way it is in this picture. And this is the setup after the accident. So the truck has moved 40 feet this direction and turned 90 degrees. It's close to this fenced off region. You have the trash cans with explosives spilled in them that didn't detonate, scattered around the area. There was another vehicle up here, a panel truck, and the other 2 gentlemen had come to the scene to help set up for this burn operation in that truck. They're the ones that had the supervisor was in that truck, he had the igniter, and this is the fence of the burned area. So anyway, that's kind of the post-accident scene in summary. This is the overall scene. So you see the fenced area here. You see the damage to the panel truck that the supervisor drove in, and you see this truck it was the explosives truck that the material was being brought in on. This item over on the fence over here is the hydraulic lift of the tailgate that's got stuck on the fence over there. There is some smoke coming up over here in the picture. That's real. There was, after the explosion, people rushed down there to try to offer assistance and see what's happened. But there was a gasoline fire because of the truck. As the gasoline fire was going down, then a box of Baratol began to burn. And so it was a little while before they could actually get down to the scene. They stay under cover while it's still burning. So I'm going to mention here also that using these pictures as well as we could determine it, we tried to place the memorial for this accident as close to the scene as we could. So there's still this road with this bend in it, and the memorial is about right here. If you to go out there, and you can't because it's behind the fence in a classified area, it's a very pastoral and scenic view and offers a nice reverent place. We don't use this as a burn ground right now. They had 3 burn pads going at the time because they had so much to do, and you couldn't use, and you had to let one cool down before you could go to the next one and use it. So alternating days, they had a rotation cycle that they went through. So 4 men were killed in this accident. Only 2 bodies were found. One up in this area, up on this knoll, one out of the view over here. And their funerals are reported to be that this accident happened on a Wednesday and their funerals were the following Saturday. And the newspapers report the others are yet to be scheduled, yet to be identified. We know who was working down there, but it was couldn't identify the body. Question?
I have a question about the memorial. Are there any plans that you know of to move the memorial to some other site where they can be viewed and by the public rather than behind two gated fences? Is it working?
Yeah, I just want to turn it off so we don't get feedback. So the memorial, I'm going to get to the story of the memorials and explain to you how that story came to be. I will give the short answer now and say that there's two reasons for the memorials. One is for the families, and one is for the workers who are there today to remember the price that's been paid for them to be able to do their work safely, and that they need to follow safe practices in working with explosives. I am now, so that's where we began. When I had some responsibility for the safety of the people that are performing these exact same operations today, I felt like we needed to do something for our workers to help them remember these accidents. And so that was the first priority. It was later that I discovered that there was a significant need for the family also to visit these sites. So there's been one visit to each of these sites inside the secure area by members of the family. So today I participate in the LANL History Committee, and they've asked me to be the chair of a subcommittee for remembering other fatalities around the laboratory as well, other laboratory workers who have died. And in the process of doing that, we're having these exact discussions. Where is a public place that we can put this that's a reverent environment and can be, and the public can visit and the family can take pictures and those kinds of things. So it doesn't exist, but it's being discussed. It's a topic we recognize a need.
I just have a question. Do you know what sort, and if ever, there was any compensation to these families?
I only know that anecdotally. I don't have any document references, so as I visit with the families, sometimes they share with me what small compensation there was or none. For example, a widow was offered employment, some small cash settlement, and employment at the laboratory, that sort of thing. But I don't think there was anything real significant.
Does LANL plan on compensating or doing anything for these families, and especially the families that left these widows and minor children?
That's a good question, and I can't speak for the laboratory on that one. I think that I will say this, I guess I don't need two microphones, that as I started to get into the idea of creating these memorials, there was some concern expressed about these kinds of questions. What if people come forward with lawsuits or want to do something today to get compensation and that sort of thing? So some people were concerned about that. And the answer I was given was that statutes of limitations have expired. It's safe, it's okay, the story needs to be told. So I don't think there's any legal recourse anymore. And that doesn't really answer your question. It's whether the laboratory, out of the goodness of their heart, would do something. That's your question. You're nodding in agreement. So I can't speak for the laboratory on that. I can register the comment and the concern, but it's not being planned right now. That's the honest answer. This is a simulation of what the truck looked like beforehand with the trash cans in place. Same sort of a truck. The tailgate part way up, part way down. This is the truck that was actually involved in the accident. At the place where it came to rest. Again, here's these HE cans with pieces of HE spilling out that did not detonate. But clearly it was burned. Lots of changes to explosives operations after these two accidents. And by the way, in England this same year, there was also an accident with a similar type of a plastic bonded explosive. And so the whole world, as it relates to explosives, was taking note this year and saying, we've got to do things better. We can't ever let this happen again. And it hasn't. Some of the things that we did differently, we went to written procedures. Machining operations went to remote operations, not standing in front of it for the most part, and for the particularly damaging, risky, high-risk operations, like drilling small holes. And packaging of explosives is a different one. Instead of having all these pieces of explosive rattling around together in a metal can, each piece is individually packaged and padded and in a secure container so it doesn't fall over if it's dropped. It stays in the container. It's not explosive on grid or on ground. We've changed significantly the way that we do burn operations, much smaller quantities, not such a complex operation. Don't try to depend on the explosives to be dry to burn them. We burn them wet, and we start it with a propane torch, and it dries off the water, and then it burns the explosive rather than having to dry them and handle them dry. And PBX 9010 hasn't been used. I only know it from historically. I've never worked with PBX 9010. That's my telephone number. Not PBX, but 9010. It was replaced with a safer explosive.
I have another question, please. The statute of limitations, do you by chance know when?
Please repeat the question, even though he's saying it into the microphone.
Okay.
How it was calculated and what determined it?
So the question is about the statute of limitations, how it's calculated, what determined. I don't know the answer to that. I just know that's the answer that I got from the laboratory legal counsel office. So I'm not going to be able to address any legal issues tonight. If somebody wants to explore that, that's a different person. And the other thing I want to mention is I talked about how we did small-scale sensitivity tests after the 1956 accident. So we learned from these accidents that things can change at scale. A large piece of explosive, when it drops, is not the same as dropping some powder on the floor. And so we went to some large-scale sensitivity testing also. And this affected nuclear weapons design. Large nuclear weapons systems were being designed with these explosives. And after these accidents, they said, we can't put such big pieces of this explosive in a nuclear weapon. And so they went back and started using TNT-based materials for those large weapon systems.
I have a personal question. Could you possibly not raise your left arm?
Is that, oh yeah, look at that. Okay. Maybe I should stand on the right side.
Raise your left arm.
Whoa, look at that. Can you still hear me? Thank you for being brave and pointing that out. I'm sorry for the trouble it's caused. We have a question over here.
We would like to know what kind of standard procedures you had at that time before the accident happened, not only afterwards, but what were these individuals, trained on or not to do, and who determined that these things were ready to be burned or disposed of? Was there a safety officer involved that looked at the stuff and see, hey, this is hazardous more than usual? Or can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So the question was kind of what safety practice was at the time of the accidents. What training have the men had and that sort of thing. And the accident reports are probably the best source for that kind of explanation. As I reviewed them, all of them were trained in what they were doing. They were experienced in what they were doing. There were explosive safety officers at the time. The authors.
What was the role of the safety officers? Yes.
I don't know what the role of the safety officer was in 1956, 1959. I don't know from the documentation. I know there was limited written procedures that came along later. So we would have to ask somebody else.
Also, on the investigation report, it's suggested that some of these individuals were sort of limited in their English, and that you had some employee that was Spanish speaking that was a translator. You know, was he certified as a bilingual, or, you know, how do you explain this high technology, or how do you translate it into the language that these individuals were more familiar with?
So the question, just to repeat it, is about the language barrier. It is true that all 7 of these men were native Spanish speakers, and some of the accident reports refer to limited English speaking skills, and sometimes a second person had to be involved. So how well that worked, how effective that was for this specialized technology, I don't know the answer to that. Can't answer that. I know that it is, you've read the accident reports, it sounds like. You referred to the Spanish language thing, it's particularly in this accident, I think.
Well, it was identified as
It was,
a weakness, I think, or that's how I interpret it.
I think it was identified as, we need to look at this and see if this was a probable cause. So I think they documented the fact that it was a consideration. I don't think it was deemed to be something that caused or could have prevented the accident. In terms of certification as bilinguals, that was a long time before that sort of thing.
It's very high-tech stuff, you know.
It is.
For an educated person to understand. Well,
Yeah, that's a valid comment. I just can't address it. So let me keep going a little bit, okay? I want to get to the story of the memorials. We're close to finishing the end. So many of you know that there's been a lot of lack of information, and you feel that keenly. So I didn't discover that. You've been living with that, some of you, for decades. I was in 2006, the Los Alamos National Laboratory was changing contractors. It was going away from the University of California and going to the current day LANL Corporation. They asked me to be a group leader and be responsible for the operations that include the machine of explosives and the burn grounds operations. So I was asked maybe in the April time frame to do this job, and decided that's what I wanted to do. So I'm already feeling responsibility for the safety operations. I'm learning about these accidents. I can't remember exactly when they came to my awareness. And then in May of 2006, I see that the laboratory has erected a memorial to the people who died in the September 11, 2001 terrorist attack on the Pentagon. And they put it in front of the brand new main office building. It's appropriate that we have exhibit in this memorial sort of a way our connection with the Department of Defense. The Pentagon as a building was designed by the project leader, was Leslie Groves, the same project leader for the Manhattan Project. It's probably the reason he got the job as a Manhattan Project person from a military point of view, because he did so well in building the Pentagon. We still have and all along the way, we've had lots of interactions and ties with the Department of Defense. So it's appropriate that we have this sort of a memorial. But the question I ask myself is, where is the names of in my mind at that time, the 6 people who died in the explosives accidents? We need to remember them. We owe them something. They've given us a lot. They've given us a safe environment to work in. So, and this is real safety. If we don't learn from the past, then we're doomed to repeat it. So with these things in mind, I began my job as a group leader and started down this idea of memorials. And as I started to talk about it within the laboratory initially, for these 1959 accidents, there are connections that are still at the laboratory and still in the area. So people would hear about it. I would learn about family connections, their need, their lack of information. One example that's represented by this picture, I was helping coach a baseball team, and one of the boys, I remember his mother telling me that this boy's grandfather was killed machining explosives, and that she wouldn't allow her husband to work with explosives in machining. So that was just, when I was the coach, that was just an interesting thing. But then when I became responsible for explosives machining, I thought something more needs to be done. So I went to this boy's home and talked to his dad and met him and met the widow of Ray Means. And that very touching for me personally. And they were very appreciative of something being done after all these years. So that's kind of the story of how we started down this path. And so we also put a memorial. I'm going to do these memorials in reverse order. We're going to do from the way I described the accidents. This is the first memorial that was visited by the family. We have this rock out here at the burn grounds. The family was invited to come and visit 50 years after the fact. Our goal was to try to have these memorials in place for a 50th anniversary, and we were successful with that. The one at Building 260, this is an aerial view of this really long building, over 700 feet, about 30 feet wide. Bay 2 is down on this end. I tried to indicate before where we put it inside the machining bay, so people walk by there, they see it and they remember. And this is a picture of it on the wall. When we had the family come out and visit this one in March of 2011, that was associated with Leo Guerin's birthday, as it turns out. And he had some family that was there, and it was a special time for them. We also had one of the HE machinists from the time come out on that family visit, and he's here tonight, Robert Marr. And his son is going to come up and make a statement.
Yeah, so my dad and I...
Hold the microphone up to your mouth close.
Yeah, my dad and I actually went to this memorial out at 260, and Cary asked my dad to make a statement or to say something about it. So I'm honored to be here tonight. Each one of us contributed to the end of the Cold War. We all knew Building 260 was a dangerous place to work, but these two men gave the most. Okay, yeah. Okay. Two great men were lost that day, but it made the processing and machining of high explosives much safer. On behalf of all of the employees who worked with these great men, we will always remember and be thoughtful for what they did, and they will always be in our, always have a special place in our hearts. Robert Morris.
Thank you, Larry. So, interesting piece of story there. Mr. Marr was working the swing shift that night along with Ray Means. They both had the same position in the machining operations. They were both assistant machining foremen. Mr. Marr had a physical scheduled, so he went up to the lab medical place and was there at his appointment. And Ray Means was covering for him in the machining bays. And as he was coming out, Bob Marr was coming out of his medical appointment, then he heard the explosion and things like that. So we appreciate the fact that he's here tonight and the fact that he visited with the family and that he has this feeling in his heart that he knows it could have been different. And he's grateful for sympathetic, maybe be the place. This is the last memorial. This is the last memorial that was erected. It was last May, and it's to the first accident. So this is one man. This was early on. I'd worked at this site for several years, and I don't remember hearing about this accident. When I returned to this site after working out at S-Site, and they learned about the S-Site memorials, they said, we would like to remember Mr. Escobar as well. And so would you make a memorial? So this is what we did, and the group leader there wanted to put it at the main entrance to that building so that his explosive workers would see it when they come by. So he was the youngest man. He also had the youngest children. He had a daughter that was about 3, one that was 1, and one that was to be born the following November. The family, the widow left town soon after the explosion, took her girls and went up to stay with her parents in Colorado. And none of the immediate family lives in this area to this day. They lost connections with the laboratory. Of course, they would come back and visit the father's gravesite in Santa Cruz. And but when they came for the family visit, they're all coming from out of state, California, Colorado. And they came last May, and it was a very poignant experience for me. So this has been a very rewarding journey for me. I call this the culmination because this is the last memorial that we put for the explosives fatalities. But as I met with the LANL History Committee today, it seemed, and as I see this audience here tonight, and this is the first public telling of these stories, it's a different time than it was back then. The town was a closed and secure town. It didn't open until 1957. So not only could families not really know what kind of work was going on up here, but they couldn't even come up to town, at least in the 1956. That changed in 1957, so 1959 maybe, but it's still kind of in that mode of a pretty closed town, pretty closed operation. Even the books about explosives that were written in that time period and are unclassified today were classified at the time. So there's a lot that the men in these families couldn't say, or that the people who came to visit the families after the accidents, that they couldn't really say a lot either. There's not a lot that could be said. So we are blessed to be in a time in general of more openness. The laboratory in general is more open to community outreach and sharing of information than sometimes in the past. So that's why we can be here tonight. So we remember and honor the sacrifices. The group leader for the last memorial, they put it up there. This memorial serves as a daily reminder for those of us who work at the site to fully embrace our safety values and to remember that we are wiser and safer today as a result of some unfortunate sacrifices from the past. That's the summary statement. I personally am grateful for the things that we've learned from these sacrifices. I am very appreciative of the graciousness of the family in showing their appreciation for having this information and interacting with me. It's a tender subject, and I don't want to betray any family privacies or anything like that. I want to tell the story that needs to be told in a sensitive way. So thank you for being here tonight for the first public telling of these stories. And I'm happy to answer questions. We're already to past 8:30, so we've been here for the full time. So I'll stay for a while if there's some other private questions and things.
Thank you, Cary. Let's take a few more questions now. Any now?
I just wanted to express something. I just wanted to say a few things about how difficult it was for me, and I'm sure it wasn't just me, the people that tried to get access to the records of the families of these folks. To my knowledge, I believe I am the only one that has a job description of Mr. Pacheco. I believe, whether intentionally or unintentionally, many of the records were not there. When the public, when the Freedom of Information Act was enacted, we looked for records, and unfortunately, many of them were not there.
Thank you. So just to summarize again the comment, he tried through the Freedom of Information Act to get more information, documentation, and records, and it didn't seem to be there, didn't seem to be available. Another comment?
I just want to thank you for all of the work, and and we expressed some frustration because we've been frustrated for over 50 years. A lot of this information was not available until, I think, in the 1970s or maybe even later. And like you said, at that time, people didn't challenge what was going on in Los Alamos, and there was hardly any information given to the families that were affected by this or these accidents. And that's sad because there might be some healing, but there's still some hard feelings.
Yeah.
Because we don't know, like you said, there were some remains. What happened to those remains? We still don't know. We don't know where those remains were sent to. We don't know what were in the caskets. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions. And these are important things to my wife and to her family, and to the other members that lost a father, brother, and so we still have those questions. And if you can guide us, or
That's perfectly reasonable, and I'm happy.
Guide us to where the bodies or the remains were sent and what happened to those remains.
Yeah, the accident report says they went to the Los Alamos Medical Center. That's all that I know.
And the medical center doesn't have any record.
Yeah.
Supposedly.
So I think there might not be answers to some questions, but I certainly couldn't present all the information tonight. So I'm happy to still try to be a resource to help answer what questions I can. But again, I'm an explosives guy. Wasn't there, and I'm not a lawyer.
I know.
Those kinds of things. But
We appreciate your work.
thank you.
I just want to make a comment I'm the granddaughter of Sevede Mahan, who was killed in the accident. And I want to thank you for holding this tonight and opening up the conversation. And I want to thank all the families that are here that have lost their loved one, like you said, a brother, a husband, an uncle, a grandfather, and we never got to know those people. And again, opening up the conversation and on the path of making things right for our families. So thank you for that. So.
Thank you.
Cary?
Yes.
Up here.
Okay. Shout it out.
You're saying you're doing memorials. Is it just for these people that were killed in explosions, or is it going to be memorials for other people that were killed at the laboratory?
Other people. So the future is for other people who were killed at the laboratory. Whether we can do something that puts the name of every person on it, we're discovering that's a little bit problematic. In this case, it's clear who the people are, the names, and where the things happen, and so we can do that. So it's in process right now, and we'll have to see how it evolves, where to locate it, and how to do it appropriately. The LANL History Committee, I was just meeting with them again this afternoon, like I mentioned, is determined to do it. How it's going to end up, what it's going to look like, I'm not sure.
Okay, the reason why I asked, it's going to be 53 years on Thursday that my father was killed at TA-66.
TA-66? Sigma Building.
Yeah, and my poor mother has mourned his death for the past 53 years, every day. And I was 2 years old when my dad was killed. And he made comment of getting a part-time job. That was my mom. That's all they gave her was a part-time job. And he deprived me and my sister of knowing our father.
Thank you for sharing that. So here's a woman whose father was killed, just to repeat the scenario again, killed at the Sigma building of the laboratory in 1953, did you say?
February 14th, 1961.
1961, 53 years ago. And a mother was given a part-time job. That was her compensation from the laboratory. And of course, she never had a chance to meet her father. So what I've been told is it's most helpful to have an advocate on the inside. So somebody who is working at the Sigma building and knows about that and can do something about it is probably the best way to try to dig into that. I don't have the expertise or the connections to be able to pursue that one, but we certainly want to remember that person as we do the general LANL memorial. So if you want to send me what information you have, I'd be happy to keep that in mind as we continue to develop a more broader memorial. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your comment.
One more question or comment? Okay, let's, before we give Cary one last round of applause.
One more.
I would like to meet the family of Escalastico.
Go ahead and put up the microphone.
And Leopoldo, because I was selected to go notify them about the accident. And so,
Do you
if
want-
we're here, I
do you
would
want
like to meet them.
Do you want to share your name?
Larry Fulgenzi.
So here's Larry Fulgenzi. He was the one that was chosen to go notify the
Two families, Escalastico and Leopoldo.
Escalastico and Leopoldo. I think those were the two that came along later, right?
So I worked out at this site for 40 years.
Worked at that site for 40 years. He would like to meet the families, Martinez and Pacheco. Thank you. And I think that you got that assignment because you
Mel
also...
Brooks was my group leader.
And Mel Brooks is here as well. We're honored to have his presence. I know that it was a difficult situation for these men to be in. It takes a lot of courage for you to come tonight and open yourself up to meeting
I did
these.
it because I do English and Spanish both, so I was either...
So here's a bilingual that could understood the message and could give it in the native language of the families involved. So thank you for your courage. I hope the families got that message and maybe you'd like to meet him afterwards and talk to him. Any other questions or comments?
We got one back here.
Hi, good evening, and my name is Marie, and thank you for this presentation. I think it was a big, important thing for our community, not just for our community, but for our whole nation. And I think these people need to be recognized a little more. It's important that we recognize explosives too, but I think a family is a lot more important. And I'm glad we had this talk. If it wouldn't have been for you, we probably would have never heard about it. We had to wait about 50 years to hear it. And we had to find out this way and that way. My uncle was Leopoldo Pacheco. I never got to know him. I was only 2 years old, like Yoli. But I still remember him, and I'm proud of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Okay, so there are display materials over in the side room here, refreshments in the Curtis room. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you families. Let's give Cary Skidmore a round of applause.
Thank you, Todd.